The day Landon Pierce told me he could ruin my career, he did not raise his voice. That was his style. He stood behind the glass wall of his corner office, Washington skyline stretched behind him like proof of power. He spoke calmly, logically, almost gently. He reminded me of the non-compete clauses. He reminded me of his relationships with every major firm in D.C. He explained how reputations are shaped quietly and destroyed even more quietly. Then he told me that if I walked away from Pierce and Rowe Consulting, I would not work in high-level strategy again. I remember noticing how steady my breathing was. I had already prepared for this. For 3 years, I had been his most trusted crisis strategist. I built risk models that predicted scandals before journalists found them. I wrote narratives that softened corporate disasters. I knew how influence moved behind policy. I knew how information could be delayed just long enough to protect stock prices. I also knew something he didn't realize. I had already seen what we were protecting. 6 months before that meeting, I uncovered internal communications tied to a pharmaceutical client. The data didn't match public statements. Negative clinical results were known earlier than disclosed. Our firm had not fabricated anything, but we had advised on timing. Timing that protected valuation. Timing that delayed public clarity. When Landon threatened my future, he assumed I was afraid of losing access to power. He did not know I was afraid of becoming part of something irreversible. I walked out of his office without arguing. I did not defend my resignation. I did not negotiate, because my exit plan was never about finding another job. It was about protecting myself from what was coming. He believed he had cornered me, but I had already started building a different kind of leverage, one rooted in truth, not intimidation. And the moment he tried to silence me, he unknowingly accelerated the countdown. He thought my resignation was an act of defiance. He had no idea it was the final step before exposure. 6 months earlier, I was restructuring crisis language for a pharmaceutical client preparing earnings reports. At first, nothing looked unusual. Legal phrasing was cautious as expected. Risk disclaimers were embedded precisely where they needed to be. But I had been an investigative journalist before I became a strategist. My instincts had never fully disappeared. Certain email timestamps felt off. Certain draft revisions referenced side effects that did not appear in the final version of public filings. So I looked deeper. I cross-referenced internal communication chains with regulatory submissions. I reconstructed version histories. I tracked advisory notes from our firm recommending strategic delay until valuation stabilizes. That phrase stayed with me. Strategic delay. The side effects were real. They were not fabricated. But disclosure timing was adjusted to protect market confidence during a sensitive merger, technically legal, morally distorted, and my predictive model had helped calculate the safest window for release. The realization did not hit me all at once. It unfolded slowly, like understanding you are standing on a fault line. I began quietly preserving documentation, not dramatic downloads, not suspicious transfers, just careful archiving of draft trails and advisory memos. I did not know if I would ever use them. But I needed to know I could win. I submitted my resignation months later. It was because I could no longer separate my skill from the outcome. If federal regulators eventually reviewed disclosure timing, I would be part of the chain. Landon thought I was ambitious. He thought I wanted a higher title somewhere else. He didn't realize I wanted distance from a storm already forming, and when he threatened to bury my career, something inside me hardened, not out of anger, but clarity. He believed silence was loyalty. I believed silence was complicity, and I was done confusing the two. What Landon didn't know was that federal regulators had already started asking quiet questions about pharmaceutical disclosure patent. After my resignation attempt, everything changed. Not openly, subtly. My access credentials were adjusted under the excuse of cybersecurity restructuring. I was removed from 2 high-profile client briefings. A junior associate was assigned to support my workload, which effectively meant monitoring it. Landon never confronted me directly again. He didn't need to. Isolation is more powerful than confrontation, he reminded the firm in a general memo about non-disclosure obligations. He referenced loyalty as a cornerstone of success. He emphasized how fragile reputations are in this industry. Every sentence was aimed at me without using my name. What he didn't understand was that pressure clarified my resolve. Meanwhile, I heard through professional networks that a federal subcommittee was reopening reviews on clinical trial transparency. Several of our past clients were listed for preliminary inquiry. My pulse didn't race when I read the notice. It slowed. Because I knew documentation mattered now, I contacted a federal compliance attorney through protected channels. I asked about whistleblower safeguards. I asked about documentation thresholds. I asked what constituted advisory liability versus criminal exposure. I did not mention Landon's threat. Not yet. Inside the firm, file restructuring accelerated. Older drafts were archived. Communication threads shortened. Legal language tightened. Digital history was being cleaned. Fortunately, I had preserved original versions. The moral weight pressed heavily on me. I knew exposure would not only affect Landon. It would impact analysts, assistants, interns, people who had no idea how timing strategies were designed. But if patient risk increased because disclosure was delayed, silence would be worse. Every day I felt like standing between two collapsing walls. And then the subpoena arrived. The moment federal investigators requested 5 years of advisory communications, I realized the secret I carried was no longer hypothetical. The subpoena did not accuse us of wrongdoing. It simply requested documentation. That was more dangerous. Landon gathered senior partners in the conference room that smelled like polished wood and controlled panic. He assured them everything complied with regulatory standards. He emphasized procedural discipline. Outwardly, I agreed. Inwardly, I knew the original drafts told a fuller story. Investigators wanted communication trails tied to pharmaceutical advisory timing. They wanted version histories. They wanted internal commentary around market stabilization. Landon ordered a digital audit to ensure nothing improper remained exposed. External cybersecurity consultants reviewed server logs. They found nothing unusual. Because I had not acted recklessly, my preserved files were stored through encrypted legal channels, protected under whistleblower statute guidelines. The tension between us intensified without words. When he looked at me across the conference table, I sensed suspicion without proof. He invited me into his office again. This time, he didn't threaten. He spoke about shared victories, about trust, about how damaging internal betrayal could be, not just for leadership, but for everyone. For a second, doubt surfaced. Was I about to destroy hundreds of livelihoods? But then I remembered the side effect data, real people, real consequences. My loyalty could not be to image management. I finalized the protected submission that night. I transmitted the full documentation package, original drafts, advisory notes, timeline comparisons, through my attorney to federal investigators. The send button felt deceptively small. But the moment it left my control, everything changed. When federal investigators expanded the scope of their inquiry citing newly submitted evidence, Landon finally realized someone inside the firm had shifted the balance. The media coverage began cautiously. Financial outlets questioned disclosure timing across multiple pharmaceutical firms. Analysts debated ethics versus legality. Then Pierce and Rowe's name appeared in official filings. Landon went on television projecting calm authority. He framed advisory services as strategic communication within legal boundaries. He emphasized cooperation. Internally, panic spread in whispers. Clients paused contracts. Competitors sensed vulnerability. Associates worried about liability. I continued coming to work. No one knew officially that I was the protected source, but Landon's gaze lingered on me longer during meetings. Not angry, searching. Federal investigators requested original draft versions. Sanitized server files did not match metadata recovered from external backups. Discrepancies widened. A mid-level executive from one pharmaceutical client testified that disclosure had been strategically aligned with valuation protection. That phrase sounded familiar because we had written it. Watching the narrative unravel felt surreal. I had spent years mastering reputation preservation. Now I was witnessing reputation collapse from the inside. I did not feel victorious. I felt responsible. Employees who had never touched disclosure strategy feared layoffs. Assistants avoided eye contact. The firm's aura of invincibility fractured. One afternoon, Landon stood in the hallway outside my office longer than necessary. He didn't confront me. He didn't need confirmation. He understood. The threat he once made, to ruin my career, echoed in my memory. The irony was undeniable. I had risked my career long before he tried to take it. When federal prosecutors offered executive immunity in exchange for testimony, the man who once controlled every narrative faced a decision that would redefine his legacy. Immunity required admission. Landon's legal team presented him with options: fight aggressively and risk escalation, negotiate partial responsibility, or cooperate fully. For decades he had advised clients to minimize admission. Now he had to choose for himself. During legal discovery, he learned officially that I was the whistleblower. He did not retaliate. That surprised me. In a federal hearing, he acknowledged that advisory timing had prioritized market stabilization over immediate transparency. He framed it as systemic culture, but he accepted executive responsibility. The statement traveled across every major news network. Pierce and Rowe's valuation plummeted. Board members initiated structural reform. Independent ethics oversight committees were established. Leadership authority was diluted. I watched the testimony from my apartment. I expected anger. Instead, I saw something fracture in him, not ego, but certainty. He realized influence built on silence cannot withstand exposure. After the hearing, he signed my resignation acceptance letter without conditions. No threats, no legal intimidation, just a signature. For the first time since he told me he could ruin my future, I felt the weight lift. But consequences were far from over. As Pierce and Rowe began restructuring under federal oversight, I received an offer that would place me on the opposite side of the system I once protected. The offer came from a federal ethics advisory division. They wanted someone who understood strategic delay tactics from the inside. I accepted. Transitioning from crisis strategist to policy reform advisor felt surreal. I now helped draft transparency standards that would prevent the kind of advisory maneuvering I once engineered. Pierce and Rowe underwent transformation. Independent compliance officers reviewed every advisory structure. Several clients left rather than adapt. Landon stepped back from daily operations. His authority became collaborative rather than absolute. Months later, we met once more in a neutral office. No threats, no leverage. He acknowledged that my decision forced reform he would never have initiated alone. He admitted that he once equated loyalty with silence. I told him my choice was never about destroying him. It was about correcting a system that had normalized delay over clarity. Our conversation was measured, professional, restrained. We would never return to mentor and strategist. But we were no longer adversaries. Years later, when congressional hearings cited Pierce and Rowe's restructuring as a model for ethical reform, I realized the secret I once hid had reshaped more than one firm. Congressional hearings referenced Pierce and Rowe as a case study in post-investigation reform. I sat behind policy advisors reviewing updated disclosure frameworks. Landon testified again, this time about structural transparency, oversight mechanisms, and ethical escalation pathways. He did not deny the past. He described it as a turning point. I reflected on the day he told me he could ruin my career. He believed power was control over futures. What he didn't understand was that my future had already shifted the moment I chose integrity over silence. My career did not collapse. It transformed. The firm he built did not vanish. It evolved. The threat that was meant to silence me became the catalyst for accountability. Sometimes power speaks in ultimatums. Sometimes truth answers in documentation. Looking back, I do not define that chapter by fear. I define it by choice, because the moment he tried to own my future, I had already decided what kind of professional and what kind of person I would become. He believed he could destroy my career with a single sentence. He never realized I was already carrying the evidence that would redefine both of ours.